In 1974, Portugal emerged from dictatorship with dreams of prosperity. By the 2000s, EU funds and booming tourism seemed to make that dream real. Yet by 2025, many well-educated professionals still earn wages that barely cover the rent for a modest flat in the country's major cities. In the first quarter of this year, Portugal recorded the fastest house price growth in the entire European Union, an almost 16% jump in just 12 months. How did a nation that rebuilt itself after decades of hardship slide into another cycle of inequality? We'll trace the policies and choices that turned opportunity into a deep affordability crisis, beginning with the stark numbers shaping daily life. The numbers behind the crisis. In 2025, the raw figures highlight the scale of the strain. Portugal's minimum wage currently sits at roughly 840 to 870 euros a month after tax, yet a one-bedroom apartment in Lisbon now often demands well over 1,000 euros, and in central districts regularly approaches 1,300. In Porto, rents commonly exceed 900 euros, leaving even those on average salaries with a vanishing portion of income once rent, bills, and transport are paid. For families, the gap grows wider. What once could be covered by two steady incomes now swallows nearly all monthly earnings, making basic living expenses an ongoing struggle. What is striking is how quickly this gap has widened. Since 2020, housing costs have raced ahead of wage growth every single year. In 2024 alone, Eurostat recorded one of the fastest year-on-year house price increases in Europe, nearly 16% in just 12 months. By contrast, wages crept upward at a pace that barely kept up with inflation. The mismatch is stark, shelter costs climbing in double digits while earnings add only a handful of percentage points. Already modest take-home pay is shrinking in real terms against the speed of property inflation, pulling more working households into precarious budgets. This isn't just a story of struggling low-income workers. Professions once viewed as secure, nurses, teachers, civil servants, now face housing choices that absorb most of their paycheck. Mid-career engineers in Lisbon or Porto often discover that half their net income disappears into rent before covering food, transport, or childcare. The result is an exodus from city centers to distant suburbs, or in many cases, back to parents' homes into their late 20s and 30s. What had been seen as personal milestones, moving out, starting families, buying a home, are delayed not by choice but by financial necessity. Portugal's standing within the EU makes the situation even more paradoxical. Countries such as France or Germany carry higher nominal rents but typically balance them with stronger wages and legal protections for tenants. Portugal sits on the opposite side of the equation, among the lowest median wages in Western Europe, but with housing costs approaching those of wealthier nations. It is a combination that fuels visible inequality. High-income foreign residents can outbid locals without stretching their budgets, creating whole neighborhoods where daily life caters more to visiting professionals and tourists than to long-term citizens. Cafes, shops, and even groceries increasingly orient toward customers who feel little of the strain pressing on local workers. Numbers alone cannot explain the distortion, because Portugal has not failed entirely at construction. New homes rise each year, and in fact the country boasts one of the higher ratios of dwellings per household in the EU. Yet a walk through central Lisbon reveals many renovated buildings sitting dark for most of the year. Whole floors remain empty, functioning less as housing than as investment vehicles. Others convert into short-term tourist rentals, technically available but never entering the long-term market where locals search for leases. The housing exists physically, but for those trying to live and work in Portugal's major cities, it might as well be invisible. The consequences spill far beyond balance sheets. Shortages of staff at hospitals, schools, and even municipal services have become routine, not because jobs go unfilled, but because the workers who should fill them cannot justify staying in city centers. Daily commutes stretch longer as people move further out in search of relative affordability, cutting into productivity and accelerating wear on already strained transport networks. Affordability that once defined smaller cities and towns like Coimbra or Braga is quickly disappearing as pressure radiates outward from the two major metros. In Braga, rents have nearly doubled in just a few years, driven by overflow from Porto. In the Algarve, once dependent on seasonal tourism, off-season residents now face rents reflecting peak summer prices. Even shrinking inland towns where housing had long been plentiful are no longer immune. This leaves Portugal in a paradoxical situation. A country with one of Europe's higher housing stocks per household and yet a population locked out of access. The distortion lies in how property has been financialized, both by domestic investors and foreign capital. For global buyers, Portugal offers a relatively low-cost market with strong returns, especially in high-demand areas like Lisbon, Porto, and the southern coast. For locals, however, wages that remain low compared to European peers cannot begin to match housing's new benchmark values. The result is what feels less like a shortage of homes and more like a misallocation of them. Reframing the issue this way explains why appeals to build more supply often ring hollow. When new construction is absorbed not by local families, but by international buyers or converted into short-term lets, supply never reaches the very people in crisis. Policymakers face the challenge that for decades property has doubled as both shelter and financial asset, and in Portugal those interests are colliding more visibly each year. So while wage stagnation has eroded living standards, escalating property values driven by outside demand have made daily life in major cities untenable for much of the resident workforce. At this point, the imbalance has grown into more than an economic inconvenience. Entire communities are being hollowed out, families are scattered across commuting distances, and younger generations weigh the prospect of emigrating altogether. The echoes of earlier decades, when Portugal's economic fragility pushed waves of citizens abroad in search of opportunity, are once again audible. Only this time the trigger is not mass unemployment, but a housing market whose rules no longer match average incomes. The collapse in affordability did not unfold by accident. It draws a straight line from policies that opened Portugal to global capital, tied its economic hopes to services rather than higher wage industries, and steadily turned housing into a profitable investment rather than a social necessity. To see how this trajectory began, it helps to step back a few decades to the moment when Portugal entered a new phase of modern development, one fueled by European Union funds and a growing dependence on tourism. From EU funds to tourism dependency, Portugal's economic foundation shifted decisively in the late 20th century. After years of underinvestment, entry into the European Union brought an unprecedented wave of funding that transformed the country's infrastructure. Entire stretches of new highway knit together previously isolated regions. Airports were expanded and modernized, allowing steady international traffic that had once seemed unimaginable. Historical monuments, many neglected for decades, were restored and promoted as cultural icons. For the first time in living memory, Portugal's infrastructure aligned with that of its wealthier neighbors, and there was a tangible sense of arrival into the modern European fold. Beneath this visible success, however, deeper limitations remained. Much of the money strengthened national connectivity, but did not create industries capable of sustaining higher wages in the long run. Manufacturing shrank under pressure from globalization and cheaper competitors, while Portugal increasingly reoriented toward services. Investment shifted toward lower-wage, lower-productivity activities, leaving the country with a modern facade but relatively weak foundations for generating high incomes. Salaries inched upwards but still lagged far behind Western European averages, leaving households constrained by a model that improved quality of life in some areas but did not offer widespread upward mobility. By the 1990s, this imbalance pushed Portugal to cultivate a new identity abroad. Marketing campaigns positioned the country as one of Europe's most affordable and appealing tourist destinations, a land of sun-drenched beaches, well-preserved historic neighborhoods, and a cost structure that lured budget-conscious travelers. The Algarve championed itself as a year-round playground for Northern Europeans. Lisbon promoted its historic quarters alongside nightlife and culture. Porto reassumed prominence with its riverfront charm and wine cellars. The rebranding succeeded. Over time, Portugal moved away from its traditional image as a struggling economy on Europe's periphery and toward being perceived as a destination offering warmth, affordability, and authenticity. Tourism soon evolved from a supplementary income source into a structural pillar. By the early 2000s, visitor arrivals were rising steadily, and foreign spending contributed a material share of national GDP, running into tens of billions of euros. By 2024, Portugal welcomed roughly 18 million tourists, an extraordinary volume for a nation of just over 10 million residents. Lisbon's old districts were refurbished into attractions, the Algarve became synonymous with resorts and golf complexes, and Porto reinvented itself as a northern hub for cultural travel. For a country eager to close the gap with Europe's richer economies, this sudden influx of foreign capital and attention appeared to be a salvation. The problem was that much of the employment created by tourism sat at the lower end of the wage spectrum. Jobs in hospitality, waiting staff, cleaners, receptionists, and seasonal guides were central to this new economy but offered limited financial security. Average wages in the sector hovered around 1,200 euros per month, far below the cost of renting an apartment in Lisbon or Porto's most sought-after areas. This structural mismatch was apparent early. The very growth that stabilized Portugal's macroeconomic outlook left many families struggling to balance their bills. Tourism funds kept the country visible and solvent, but its labor market could not keep pace with surging living costs in the very cities where demand concentrated. The geographic impacts of this shift became clear. The Algarve's quiet fishing towns were redeveloped into resort hubs dominated by villas and holiday complexes, inflating housing values in line with seasonal demand rather than local paychecks. In Lisbon, aging neighborhoods saw rapid renovation, their apartments converted into boutique rooms for visitors or short-term lets. Porto similarly transitioned, with family dwellings near the historic center replaced by small hotels and furnished flats aimed at foreign guests. Each of these regions gained prestige and revenue while simultaneously narrowing access for residents. Locals watched as physical neighborhoods improved, but the improved space no longer belonged to them. Portugal's openness to global travel brought economic benefits but created new sensitivities. When arrivals were high, the economy looked robust. But any global downturn, be it economic recession, political instability, or crisis in air travel, exposed just how dependent entire regions had become on visitor inflows. This fragility extended into the housing market. Increasingly, homes were valued not for their role as shelter, but for their rental potential to foreign guests. Properties were purchased, renovated, and marketed not for Portuguese residents, but for short-term visitors able to pay elevated rates. Over time, this transformed housing into a commodity linked to tourism revenue streams rather than community needs. Linking prosperity to outside demand also reshaped the national investment mindset. Apartments were increasingly bought as income engines tied to passing visitors rather than as stepping stones for families. Construction and restoration continued, yet much of that supply never touched ordinary Portuguese households. Even as wages stagnated, international buyers and landlords capitalized on the perception of Portugal as a cheap yet profitable market. The policy focus that had championed tourism in the 1990s and early 2000s gave the country breathing room, but it positioned core urban housing stock as part of a cycle that excluded locals. It is important to recognize what tourism achieved and what it did not. It ensured cash flow when manufacturing declined and placed Portugal firmly on the global map. It anchored 1 in 10 jobs and lifted GDP growth rates year after year. But it could not counter weak productivity or systemic wage stagnation. The glittering statistics of record arrivals and bustling airports masked inequalities becoming clearer with each rental renewal. Brief surges in income could not compensate for the steady rise of rents and property values, and the reliance on visitors locked locals into an economic structure where gains were indirect at best. For families in Lisbon, Porto, or the Algarve, this contradiction unfolded in daily life. Plazas gleamed with renovations, cafes filled with tourists, and new airports boomed with traffic. Yet salaries from service sector jobs tied to that very activity could not secure housing nearby. Residents were pushed out of central neighborhoods, often relocating to suburbs with longer commutes or back to family homes. While Portugal appeared to be flourishing, prosperity increasingly meant income circulating around visitors, while residents absorbed rising costs with limited wage growth to match. Looking back, the trajectory from EU funds to tourism dependency shows how prosperity and precarity intertwined. Infrastructure was modernized, heritage was revived, and Portugal was reintroduced to the world as a destination. But the underlying economy leaned heavily on visitors instead of building higher-wage industries at scale. Housing markets, linked tightly to tourism flows, began rising along paths detached from domestic salaries. It is within this structural imbalance that today's affordability crisis finds its roots. The strategic reliance on tourism solved one problem while planting the seeds of another. By orienting policy and investment around outside demand, Portugal gained visibility but exposed citizens to vulnerabilities that would only intensify. Housing in particular became less about serving residents and more about attracting capital from abroad. This choice helps explain why, decades later, today's crisis feels less like an accidental outcome and more like the compound effect of pathways set much earlier. And while the flow of tourists and investors eventually reshaped housing markets, other policies amplified this trajectory in ways that would prove far more enduring. Some initiatives, introduced with the promise of saving the economy, ended up deepening dependence and accelerating housing inflation in ways no one foresaw at the time. The Golden Visa Experiment. In 2012, as Portugal struggled through the Eurozone crisis, the government introduced a policy it believed would inject fresh capital into a fragile economy: the Golden Visa program. The scheme offered residency rights in exchange for investment. And while applicants could choose from several paths, the most popular was the purchase of real estate meeting a minimum threshold of 500,000 euros. At a time of high unemployment and public austerity, this seemed like a quick way to stimulate demand and attract foreign wealth without placing further burden on the state. Over its lifespan, the program brought in more than 7 billion euros, an enormous figure for a country still reeling from years of fiscal strain. Foreign investors quickly took notice. buyers from China, Brazil, Russia, Turkey, and the Middle East flocked to Portugal, drawn by relatively low property prices when compared to other European Union countries offering similar schemes. For many, the purchase was less about relocating to Portugal permanently and more about securing EU residency while holding onto a stable asset. Lisbon, Porto, and the Algarve became prime destinations, and developers adjusted accordingly. New projects appeared with units carefully priced just above the qualifying threshold, a practice that revealed how the housing market was being steered more by visa eligibility than by local demand. Data from the following years confirmed this clustering, showing an unusually sharp concentration of sales right at €500,000 after the program began. Instead of broadening the overall housing supply, construction tilted toward these investment-focused units. Whole apartment blocks were developed for buyers unlikely to occupy them, designed more as vehicles for legal status or as a means to store capital than as homes for residents. Many of these apartments sat empty, with polished exteriors masking their lack of actual inhabitants. This added a layer of scarcity to an already pressured market. For a median Portuguese household with a net monthly income closer to €1,000, competing against international investors operating with vastly greater financial resources was nearly impossible. The divide was not only economic but symbolic. While longtime residents struggled to keep pace with rent hikes, golden-plated keys to the city went to absentee landlords living halfway across the globe. Public frustration began to simmer. Families who had lived in central neighborhoods for generations saw their surroundings shift. Traditional houses were bought up, refurbished, and sold to foreigners who often never moved in. A system once centered on affordable, community-based living was increasingly redefined by speculative ownership. More than just economic displacement, many felt a cultural loss. Portuguese cities, especially Lisbon, had long been praised for their sense of neighborhood continuity, tight-knit blocks of multi-generational households. But as the Golden Visa accelerated luxury development, those familiar bonds gave way to properties treated primarily as investments. It would be misleading, however, to describe the Golden Visa as the sole driver of Portugal's affordability crisis. Tourism expansion, strict land use regulations, and modest construction rates all contributed to rising pressure. But the policy undoubtedly acted as a powerful accelerant, funneling demand precisely where housing was already scarce and wages were already limited. Policymakers had hoped the program would stimulate job creation and spread capital more evenly. Instead, its benefits concentrated heavily in property markets, amplifying inequality and reshaping affordability in ways that outlasted the program itself. By the early 2020s, critics from both inside and outside Portugal were questioning its legitimacy. Transparency watchdogs cautioned that residence for investment schemes often created risks of financial misconduct and ineffective oversight. Inside Portugal, activists argued that the program had created very few jobs while driving up housing costs in prime neighborhoods. Studies showed that the flood of capital inflows had not translated into tangible improvements for the average resident. Yet successive governments tolerated the scheme in part because the billions it delivered eased fiscal pressure during a vulnerable decade. Eventually, mounting discontent forced change. In October 2023, the government officially ended the pathway of Golden Visa residency through direct purchases of residential real estate in high-density and coastal areas. Property was no longer an automatic ticket to residency for new applicants. This reform acknowledged the strain the program had placed on urban housing markets and signaled an attempt to recalibrate policy back toward local needs. But by the time it happened, the damage was deeply ingrained. The exit threshold of €500,000 had already reshaped market psychology. Developers still priced luxury units near that value. Landlords adjusted rental expectations upward, and buyers, both Portuguese elites and foreigners, operated on the assumption that prime properties in Lisbon or Porto were simply no longer accessible below €500,000. Economists noted that once a property market becomes accustomed to a certain benchmark, values rarely fall back. The elevated floor becomes the new reference point. So even without fresh Golden Visa buyers snapping up units, years of inflated sales had permanently shifted local benchmarks beyond most residents' reach. Evidence of this legacy plays out visibly in major cities. Walk through central Lisbon, and it is common to see renovated buildings that remain sparsely used. Some operate as seasonal second homes, some as placeholders within international portfolios, and others stand fully renovated but unoccupied. Valuable for the financial position they represent more than for the lives they shelter. For local families searching for long-term leases, these apartments are effectively removed from circulation, reducing availability and tightening supply. Residents face rising rents fueled partly by this artificial scarcity, while empty units silently accumulate value. All of this contributed to a sense of structural unfairness. To many Portuguese, housing had stopped functioning as a foundation for family life and instead became an avenue for outsiders to secure visas and financial returns. The paradox was stark. The golden visa generated large sums for state accounts, yet it left ordinary citizens no closer to affordable homes. Calls grew louder for housing policy that prioritized occupancy and community over capital accumulation. But reversing the effects of more than a decade of distortion was not something that could be achieved overnight. By 2025, analysts described the golden visa as both a lifeline and a liability. It stabilized public finances at a critical moment and reinforced Portugal's global appeal to investors, but it also contributed to pricing structures now far out of step with local earnings. Removing the residency for property link was an important step, but policymakers and citizens alike recognized that the inertia of inflated valuations for both rent and ownership remains. Communities continue to shoulder the consequences of choices made in the emergency years of the Eurozone crisis. Portugal's experience with the golden visa revealed how quickly short-term measures can reshape entire markets. A policy designed to attract wealthy outsiders succeeded in doing so, but at the cost of long-term affordability and local stability. The enduring question is how Portugal can recover from patterns set during that period, or whether the new baseline is here to stay. And just as one form of international inflow began to fade, another emerged with less fanfare but equally powerful consequences. While the golden visa dominated headlines, a quieter wave of arrivals was already reshaping how Portuguese cities function and who can afford to live in them. The rise of the remote worker. In 2022, Portugal introduced a new pathway for foreign arrivals that reshaped its housing market in quieter but still significant ways: the digital Nomad visa. Unlike the golden visa, which tied residency to property purchases, this program targeted income instead, offering residency rights to remote workers earning well above the Portuguese average. At a glance, the policy looked different. No investment thresholds or luxury developments were involved. But for locals in Lisbon, Porto, and key coastal towns, the outcome was recognizably similar. Demand for homes rose further, prices climbed higher, and the distance widened between resident wages and new arrivals' spending power. To qualify, applicants needed to prove a steady income roughly 4 times the Portuguese minimum wage. In practice, this translated into earnings of about 3,335 per month. For comparison, Portugal's minimum wage in 2022 sat just above €800, and the median salary hovered closer to €1,000. By design, the program admitted only high earners, often professionals employed abroad in technology, finance, or consulting. These newcomers arrived with incomes 3 to 4 times greater than most Portuguese workers, and entered housing markets already stretched by tourism and years of speculative investment. Demand clustered in predictable places. Lisbon's riverside districts, historic quarters in Porto, and coastal towns long known for student and family life suddenly became magnets for remote workers looking for stable rentals with good internet and urban amenities. What might have been manageable in a balanced market amplified into a sharper distortion because supply was already constrained. Apartments that had once been offered at €700 to €800 quickly doubled in price. For a Portuguese nurse, teacher, or mid-level office worker, such rents were no longer feasible. For a foreign professional earning €3,500 remotely from a Berlin startup or a New York bank, however, those same rents felt strikingly cheap by comparison. Two groups existed side by side, but with spending power too unequal to allow for balance. By 2023 and 2024, statistics traced this shift. Lisbon alone reported double-digit growth in its foreign resident population compared with pre-visa years. Porto saw similar changes, with international arrivals occupying districts traditionally associated with older residents and families. Even mid-sized cities like Braga and Coimbra reported increases, partly because rising rents in Lisbon and Porto pushed some workers into secondary hubs. Rental platforms adapted quickly, with entire sections of their listings angled toward mid-term stays of 6 months to a year, products designed with digital workers in mind, not long-term local tenants. The visible results were stark. Average rents in parts of Lisbon rose more than 30% in just 2 years, while in Porto's central neighborhoods similar surges were recorded. Apartments rented at €600 in 2021 now commonly listed for more than €1,000. For a Portuguese tenant earning just over €1,100 after tax, that left little room for food, transport, or childcare. For a remote worker earning 3 times that amount, however, the price looked not only affordable but reasonable, even relative to higher costs in their home countries. Cafes, co-working spaces, and services shifted accordingly, aligning with spending patterns of an affluent, mobile population. For locals, the contrast became hard to ignore. Teachers, nurses, and municipal employees often found they could not afford to live near the schools, hospitals, or offices where they worked. In some cases, multi-generational families with long roots in city districts moved outward into distant suburbs, their place taken by short-term tenants arriving for stints of digital work. The difference was visible inside apartment blocks themselves. One floor housed a retired Portuguese couple on modest pensions, the next a foreign consultant earning 3 or 4 times the local average. These mismatched realities, though peaceful in daily interaction, underscored the wider gulf shaping the market. Specific neighborhoods became emblematic of the trend. Areas in Lisbon, once a blend of immigrant families, students, and local workers, quickly shifted toward mid-term rentals marketed directly to international professionals. The change drove rent increases far out of proportion to wage growth, sometimes 5 times faster. In Porto's old center, Airbnb listings transitioned into digital worker leases, pricing out long-time residents. Peripheral neighborhoods, once shelter for affordability, felt the ripple effect as displaced locals moved outward, straining transport networks and shifting demand into areas previously shielded from speculation. Remote workers themselves often viewed Portugal differently. Compared with London, New York, or Munich, paying €1,200 for a central, furnished apartment still represented remarkable value. In conversations with landlords and fellow expatriates, they described Portugal as affordable and even generous. That perception stood in direct opposition to locals' experience. What felt like savings to one group felt like exclusion to the other. Many Portuguese began to describe digital nomads as longer-stay tourists with higher spending power, a shorthand for the economic pressure they brought, even unintentionally. Policymakers had framed the digital nomad visa as a way to integrate Portugal into global digital trends, accelerate tax contributions from foreign residents, and keep the country competitive for international talent. But the lived outcomes in housing markets revealed strains. Portugal was not building homes at a pace sufficient to absorb extra demand. With vacancy concentrated in investment properties and short-term rentals, every new wave of higher-income arrivals squeezed availability further. This connection illustrates how the digital nomad visa fits into the broader picture. It did not carry the same weight as the golden visa's billions in real estate transactions, nor did it single-handedly trigger record-setting price spikes. But it added a fresh layer of intensity to already overheated rental markets. Combined with stagnant wages, restricted construction, and speculative ownership, the presence of well-paid remote workers exacerbated affordability challenges in the very neighborhoods where demand was most concentrated. That dynamic widened inequality in tangible ways. 2 households, perhaps sharing the same building or street, could see their monthly incomes differ by factors of 3 or more. The housing market naturally matched the higher benchmark, and services adjusted prices to meet it. Portuguese families then watched their financial margins erode as rents and daily costs aligned with foreign salaries instead of their own. This imbalance filtered into protests, local political debates, and calls for stronger regulation of visas and rental markets. Seen in hindsight, the digital nomad visa illustrates a recurring theme in Portuguese policy: short-term opportunities yielding long-term pressures on affordability. Welcoming global workers built prestige and visibility. It reinforced Portugal's image as a modern, open country with a cosmopolitan lifestyle. Yet it also locked locals out of the very urban centers that symbolized that growth. Digital workers did not displace families by force. They simply competed in the same markets with far greater resources, producing predictable and visible outcomes. As of 2025, opinions remain divided. For some, the presence of international professionals signals progress and integration into a global economy. For others, it represents another mechanism by which Portuguese citizens are priced out of their own homes. The truth lies between. The visa alone would not have created the crisis, but in a context shaped by investor capital, tourism dependency, and limited construction, it pushed markets from fragile to unsustainable. And this sets the stage for a deeper paradox. Portugal does not actually lack homes. In fact, by European standards, it has one of the highest ratios of dwellings per household. The crisis instead reflects how those homes are distributed, occupied, or withheld from circulation. Understanding why affordability has collapsed requires looking not only at who is arriving, but also at how housing stock itself is being used, and how much of it remains empty. Empty homes and limited construction. Portugal's housing story contains a striking paradox. By European standards, this is not a country lacking in homes. Official figures show that by 2025, Portugal has roughly 1.4 dwellings for every household, one of the highest ratios in the European Union. On paper, such a surplus should eliminate any perception of scarcity. Yet the lived reality is one of residents struggling to secure affordable rentals, neighborhoods hollowed out by vacancy, and families unable to find suitable housing within their income limits. The explanation lies less in the quantity of dwellings than in how those dwellings are used, who they are built for, and why so little new supply reaches the people who need it most. In Lisbon's historic center, vacancy is not accidental but structural. Facades gleam with fresh paint, suggesting urban vibrancy, but many apartments behind them remain shuttered for much of the year. A significant proportion are owned by investors who keep them idle, waiting for long-term price appreciation. Others have been converted into short-term tourist flats, marketed on international platforms to visitors staying weeks or months at a time. According to national data, more than 11% of Portugal's housing stock has been diverted into temporary tourist accommodation, while in some central districts that share reaches as high as 60%. On the ground, it means that large numbers of physical dwellings never enter the long-term rental pool. For ordinary families, the effect is indistinguishable from shortage. Apartment listings shrink while demand continues to climb. Porto mirrors this imbalance. In its Ribeira district, one of Portugal's most photographed areas, the majority of homes function as visitor accommodation rather than permanent housing. Walking the narrow streets reveals shops and bars thriving on tourist traffic, but longtime residents have steadily left. Where communities once revolved around shared schools, groceries, and neighborhood associations, many now contend with transient occupancy, apartments whose doors change hands weekly or monthly. The old fabric of stability, children growing up in the same streets, neighbors knowing neighbors, erodes under pressures defined less by local earnings than by foreign spending power. The Algarve provides an even more extreme example of seasonal vacancy. In peak summer months, towns across the region burst with apparent prosperity as homes fill with tourists, second home owners, and seasonal workers. Yet in winter, whole streets lie dark, with houses shuttered until the following summer. Villages appear depopulated despite holding far more physical homes than year-round residents. This cycle locks out local families. When demand spikes seasonally, rents jump far beyond year-round affordability. When demand drops, landlords prefer to wait rather than offer long-term contracts at lower rates. For permanent residents, the stock exists but is functionally unavailable. Compounding the vacancy issue is Portugal's chronically low pace of building. Over the last decade, the construction rate averaged only around 11 newly completed homes per 1,000 residents, a figure well below the European average. In wealthier northern countries, steady additions to housing stock allow wages and urbanization to be matched by new supply. In Portugal, however, completions remain sluggish. This stagnation is particularly damaging where demand has risen fastest. Lisbon, Porto, and coastal areas attractive to expatriates or short-term residents. There, the lack of adequate additions pushes locals into competition for older stock, much of which is already locked away in short-term rentals. The barriers to higher output are not simply financial. Regulatory factors play a central role. Developers routinely face years-long waits for building permits, with municipal planning offices often overwhelmed by the volume of applications. Heritage laws in central Porto and Lisbon impose strict limitations on altering or expanding existing structures, ensuring prized streetscapes are preserved, but also freezing potentially usable space. Height restrictions limit densification in urban centers, while zoning rules discourage larger, more affordable projects in adjacent districts. These processes are not abstract episodes of red tape, but very specific obstacles, long chains of approvals, preservation requirements, and uncertain policy direction that dissuade investment in affordable housing. Even when projects are approved, the pattern of construction tilts toward mid to high-income units. Developers find it easier to market apartments to international buyers or wealthier Portuguese households than to design for low or middle-income families. Rising materials and labor costs eat into margins for modest units, while luxury developments offer higher returns. The projects that do get built, therefore, exacerbate the mismatch. Apartments are produced, but at a price point out of reach for the median wage earner. Instead of easing strain for residents, these additions often reinforce the impression that Portugal builds, but not for its own people. When vacancy overlaps with slow construction, the impacts accumulate in everyday life. Teachers or nurses searching for long-term leases in Lisbon encounter an illusory marketplace. Online platforms show hundreds of options, but many are listed only for weekends or short stays. Units that could house families full-time instead cater to international visitors, priced accordingly. For locals, the options shrink to a handful of expensive apartments, with dozens competing for each one. Even as cities report some of the highest dwelling-to-household ratios in Europe, residents face an experience of scarcity. Economists call this artificial scarcity, a shortage not rooted in physical absence but in functional unavailability. This artificial scarcity has visible social consequences. In central Lisbon, schools close because long-term families have departed, while cafes and laundries shift focus to travelers. Residents once embedded in districts for generations move to far-flung suburbs, enduring long commutes and additional costs. In Porto, neighborhoods revitalized through tourist investment lose their residential core, creating a form of depopulation masked by surface bustle. In the Algarve, towns fluctuate between overcrowded and deserted, never able to sustain consistent community life. Across all, the mismatch between abundant physical housing and inaccessible lived housing corrodes stability for locals. The contradiction provokes difficult questions about priorities. Why does a nation boasting 1.4 homes per household allow entire blocks to stand empty for investors or cycle through seasonal demand, while resident families pay a majority of their wages in rent? Why do planning regimes defend historical authenticity down to the details of building renovation, yet fail to provide pathways for affordable construction on the scale required? Policy inertia and complex regulation appear to protect assets and aesthetics more effectively than they protect citizens seeking stable housing. By 2025, the crisis has settled into an entrenched stalemate. On one hand, Portugal has no shortage of physical housing units. On the other hand, residents struggle as if the country suffers acute undersupply. Vacancy for investment, heavy reliance on short-term lets, and years of slow construction leave a market where wages cannot keep pace with rent or ownership costs. The figures confirm the paradox, but daily experience makes it tangible. Apartments dark for much of the year while workers commute 2 hours from distant suburbs. Economic misalignment, rather than physical shortage, fuels the strain. This paradox directly shapes the political atmosphere. Citizens see supply sitting idle, development stalled, and historic districts turned into open-air hotels. Each factor stems from policy choices about land use, construction approvals, and how the government allows housing to function as shelter or as financial asset. It is against this backdrop that pressure mounts for the state to act more decisively. Public frustration grows not only at the sight of rising rents, but at vacant buildings standing as symbols of exclusion. Communities wonder whether policies will finally be reoriented toward their needs, or whether government action will remain too incremental to make a difference. The next stage in Portugal's housing debate centers squarely on this question of political response. Government policies and their limits. By 2024, housing had moved to the center of national debate, forcing policymakers into action. Rising prices and mounting public anger pushed the government to unveil what was framed as a decisive package of reforms under a new housing strategy. The most prominent initiative was Construir Portugal, or Build Portugal, positioned as a flagship response to years of inaction. The program pledged to deliver approximately 59,000 new homes by 2030, supported by a funding package of about 4.2 billion euros. Alongside it, the government announced a mix of rent regulations and rules intended to limit the short-term rental market that had dominated many urban centers. On paper, it was the most ambitious attempt in years to restore affordability. Yet questions quickly emerged about whether these measures addressed short-term pain or merely offered long-term aspiration. The rent cap policy was meant to shield tenants from rapid hikes. Under the law, rent increases for existing contracts were tied to inflation, with a ceiling introduced to prevent runaway escalation. This created welcome stability for households on long-term leases who could map their budgets without fear of sudden jumps. But the policy contained a significant gap. It largely applied only to ongoing contracts. New listings were exempt, and landlords could reset prices whenever tenants moved out. For younger renters or families searching for their first home in Lisbon or Porto, this meant they re-entered a market where rents continued climbing unchecked. Economists pointed out that this distinction bluntly limited overall impact. Some tenants enjoyed partial relief, but the broader shortage of long-term, reasonably priced stock remained unresolved. Construir Portugal's promise of 59,000 new homes carried more weight, at least on paper, than piecemeal rent regulation. The scale suggested a serious investment in public housing, something Portugal had long fallen behind on compared to its European peers. However, execution posed challenges that were immediately familiar. Land acquisition moved slowly, planning departments were under capacity, and infrastructure requirements complicated many of the sites considered for development. Construction rarely starts overnight, and official estimates push the delivery timeline well into the second half of the decade. For households already priced out in 2024, the prospect of waiting until 2030 for substantial relief felt like little comfort. Critics warned that unless paired with faster interim steps, the strategy's promises risked being more symbolic than practical. Meanwhile, regulation of short-term rentals became the most visible and controversial measure. Municipalities long besieged by Airbnb-style conversions, particularly Lisbon's central parishes, Porto's historic districts, and parts of the Algarve, welcomed new caps on issuing fresh licenses. On the surface, this signaled a genuine attempt to return homes from the tourist market to residential use. But the effectiveness was blunted by both exceptions and enforcement limits. Existing licenses, numbering in the tens of thousands, were largely unaffected. a landlord operating short-term rentals in one parish could shift activity just beyond the restricted area or reclassify listings. Local inspectors were under-resourced to monitor the endless churn across digital platforms. As a result, even a highly publicized clampdown translated into limited change on the ground. Further complicating the government's credibility was the reversal of certain measures under the earlier Mise Habitat framework. Policies that once mandated forced leasing of vacant properties and special levies on short-term rentals were scaled back or shifted toward municipal oversight. Officials argued this gave local councils greater flexibility to adapt enforcement to regional needs. Critics countered that it weakened the state's ability to standardize protections nationwide. The reversals reinforced a perception of inconsistency. Announcements grew frequent, but households waited in vain for visible difference in their monthly expenses. Tax incentives introduced in 2024 were also intended to coax empty properties back to the long-term market. Landlords who signed multi-year leases with Portuguese tenants could qualify for favorable tax treatment. At first glance, this appeared like a pragmatic approach to increase supply without direct state construction, but loopholes undercut the plan. Because eligibility didn't strictly hinge on offering units at affordable rates, some landlords reaped benefits without lowering rents in line with wage realities. As housing advocates emphasized, incentives without pricing conditions simply subsidized existing distortions rather than solving them. By early 2025, reports confirmed that the reforms produced limited impact. Rent data for Lisbon, Porto, Braga, and Coimbra indicated yet another year of double-digit increases, with central districts facing the steepest rises. Median rental costs for one-bedroom apartments in Lisbon hovered far above the net monthly income of most residents despite the existence of rent caps. Home purchase prices also continued upward, unaffected by announcements of long-term public housing delivery. For the majority of households, the lived reality remained unchanged. No new stock accessible now, and no meaningful slowdown in prices. This gap between rhetoric and outcome eroded public confidence. Citizens began to view each new reform as a temporary media effort rather than an enduring change. Families who had pinned hopes on rent controls realized that only a subset of tenants would benefit. Those looking to public housing recognized that promised units were years away. And households in tourist-heavy neighborhoods saw little shift after restrictions on holiday rentals, since enforcement lagged. Each disappointment chipped away at faith in government, leaving many convinced that leaders responded only to pressure rather than steering coherent long-term policy. At a deeper level, the debate exposed structural limits. Portuguese wages remain among the lowest in Western Europe, while demand from international investors, expatriates, and digital workers remains disproportionately strong. Global capital views housing in Lisbon or Porto as a secure bet, independent of local salaries. Domestic law can regulate increases or set conditions, but cannot erase the imbalance between Portuguese incomes and foreign financial resources. Policymakers stand constrained by forces larger than national legislation, amplifying the sense of stalemate. The combination of ambitious headlines and minimal day-to-day progress set the stage for rising disillusion. For many, reforms like Construir Portugal read as distant solutions, admirable in scale but unhelpful in the present crisis. Rent caps protected some but bypassed others in greatest need. Short-term rental limits created publicity more than tangible relief. Tax incentives lightened burdens for landlords while leaving renters squeezed. By mid-2024, the narrative solidified. Portugal could announce programs, but implementation, enforcement, and timeliness consistently fell short. The consequences were not just economic but political. Voters began to direct anger at institutions they accused of indecision and inefficiency. Even households benefiting modestly from capped contracts expressed unease at their fragility, unsure whether relief would survive the next cycle of policy adjustments. Mistrust deepened across generations, from young renters locked in their parents' homes to pensioners displaced from long-held neighborhoods now gentrified by outside demand. The cumulative effect was a volatile public mood. Residents no longer viewed housing as a technical policy matter, but as the defining issue shaping their quality of life. Each additional rent hike or empty promise intensified frustration. What began as scattered discontent gradually consolidated into collective anger, expressed not only in private conversations or digital forums, but increasingly in public spaces. The tone of the national debate shifted from quiet resignation to open confrontation, with a sense that incremental fixes had reached their limit. By the close of 2024, signs of this discontent became impossible to ignore. The failure of policy packages to alter everyday realities acted as a catalyst for broader mobilization. From neighborhood associations to youth groups, voices once muted by fatigue grew louder and more organized. At this point, the national conversation was no longer about whether housing posed a problem, but about how far citizens were prepared to go to demand change. Protests and the power of public anger. In late 2024, housing stopped being only a subject of news headlines and policy debates. It became visible on the streets. Mass demonstrations in September of that year and again into 2025 brought tens of thousands of people into the squares and avenues of Lisbon, Porto, and Faro. They marched through broad boulevards and narrow alleys alike, carrying signs and chanting demands that could no longer be treated as background noise. For Portugal, these were the largest nationwide protests since the austerity years following the financial crash. What stood out was the clarity of their focus: anger at soaring rents, anger at empty apartments serving investors, and anger at government policies that seemed to protect tourism and visas more than citizens' ability to live where they worked. The crowds did not frame their demands in vague language. Protesters pointed directly at short-term rentals that hollowed out city centers, at golden visa properties left vacant for speculation, and at the influx of remote workers whose incomes reset local markets. Street slogans were blunt references to neighborhoods being sold off and homes turned into assets for outsiders. Placards and chants tied their arguments to the very policies discussed at official press conferences: rent caps seen as ineffective, public housing promises dismissed as distant, and visa options criticized for prioritizing foreign capital over residents. By naming these grievances, the marches moved the debate out of statistics and into lived experience. For many participants, the protest carried a personal weight. Residents who had grown up in central Lisbon described walking past the same houses where their families once lived, in some cases now listed online as tourist flats at prices nobody local could pay. Municipal gardeners, nurses, and teachers turned up to explain that their wages no longer matched the cost of remaining in the city. AFP reporting at the time documented elderly residents forced into makeshift rooms or leaving longtime neighborhoods entirely, displaced after landlords shifted apartments to higher-yield uses. To these marchers, the banners they carried were not simply political signals, but extensions of their own anxieties and losses. The urgency of the movement came not just from numbers but from who took part. Young Portuguese adults, especially those in their 20s and 30s, featured prominently. Many of them explained that despite holding full-time jobs, they still lived with parents or in shared flats with no realistic path to independence. For them, the core issue was not an abstract sense of inflation but the denial of adult milestones: moving out, starting families, and building lives of their own. Older residents joined as well, some in solidarity with younger generations and others because they themselves were already displaced. But the presence of youth at the front of marches crystallized the problem in political terms. The very people expected to sustain Portugal's future were those now protesting loss of opportunity in their present. The scale of protests surprised many outside observers. Where earlier demonstrations had been limited to Lisbon's older districts, by late 2024 crowds had spread across Porto, Faro, Braga, Coimbra, and even smaller municipalities. Local associations in mid-sized inland towns reported organizing rallies for the first time, citing sharp rent hikes once thought limited to the two largest cities. This breadth of participation changed the image of the movement. What began on Lisbon's historic cobblestones had stretched nationwide, giving weight to the claim that the housing crisis was not parochial but systemic. No region appeared insulated from its effects. The message carried symbolic layers as well. Protesters described themselves as being treated like tenants in their own nation, outbid not just by wealthy individuals abroad but by government policies that welcomed outside capital with open arms. Anger mounted at the idea that national streets and neighborhoods had been repurposed for temporary visitors. Demonstrations tapped into identity as much as economics, defending the right to continuity in communities that foreign ownership and speculative lettings had eroded. Many marches featured Portuguese flags, music, and local banners, reminding onlookers that housing was not just a ledger entry but the core of cultural life. Commentators noted that Portugal's protests did not occur in isolation. Spain had already seen mass mobilizations in Barcelona against touristification, and Ireland's capital faced its own marches targeting rising rents and absentee investors. Protesters themselves often drew these comparisons, presenting their demands as part of a wider European struggle against housing systems reshaped by global forces. What differentiated Portugal's case was the particularly wide gap between local wages and housing costs, leaving families squeezed even harder than peers abroad. By linking their voices with those of other countries, the demonstrators underscored that what they faced was not only local mismanagement, but also the weight of international financial flows pressing on their everyday lives. For Portugal's leadership, the scale and persistence of the marches posed a direct challenge. Government officials insisted reforms were underway, citing construction pledges and rent protections, but the presence of tens of thousands in the streets underlined a perception that it was too little too late. Each protest became a referendum on credibility rather than policy detail. Leaders claimed progress would arrive in coming years. Citizens countered that they could not last that long. The public display of anger demonstrated a collapse of patience and trust, stripping technical explanations of their persuasive power. Personal stories strengthened the protests, legitimacy in a way abstract data could not. Interviews captured by television and newspapers featured families explaining forced commutes of 2 hours because they could not secure housing in the cities where they worked. Elderly residents spoke of losing the apartments where they had lived for decades, replaced by high-priced flats they could never rent again. Parents described fear that their children would leave Portugal altogether in search of affordable futures. These accounts resonated because they echoed private conversations across the country. What had been individual struggles linked together into testimony amplified on a national scale. Over time, the protests became recognized as a political fact in themselves. They showed that housing was no longer a niche area of economic debate, but a central issue capable of mobilizing diverse segments of society. Journalists and analysts highlighted their intergenerational character. Thousands of young adults frustrated by constrained independence marching alongside pensioners defending the neighborhoods they had built. The blend of groups illuminated that the crisis was not restricted to the poorest, but stretched across classes and ages, embedding housing as a source of collective grievance rather than fragmented struggles. By the start of 2025, the persistence of demonstrations was shaping how policymakers approached the issue. Leaders faced a choice between continuing a gradualist path or acknowledging that failure to produce visible improvements risked further unrest. Few doubted by that stage that protests had successfully moved the housing crisis into Portugal's mainstream politics. Demonstrators had ensured that what might once have been treated as a complex policy problem had become a test of the state's ability to protect its citizens, livelihoods, and neighborhoods. That persistence signaled something deeper. Public anger did not seem likely to fade because it was rooted in daily experience. Rent swallowing more than half of paychecks, young workers resigning themselves to bedrooms in parents' homes, schools closing in neighborhoods hollowed out by transients. For many families, the crisis had already reshaped how they lived, and protests were less an expression of frustration than a means of survival within the political process. In this sense, demonstrations became more than events. They became symbols of resistance against being priced out of their own country. Portugal's streets in 2024 and 2025 therefore embodied a new stage in the crisis, one where apartments and wages were not only numbers but catalysts of mobilization. Each march crystallized the argument that the costs of inaction were not abstract. They were eroding trust, community, and daily life. The banners demanding stronger limits on short-term rentals, tighter curbs on foreign ownership, and faster delivery of affordable housing expressed an insistence that incremental reforms would no longer suffice. What these protests ultimately revealed is that the crisis extends beyond economics into questions of belonging and future viability. As chants echoed through the avenues and stories of displacement filled media coverage, Portugal was forced to confront the reality that its citizens were no longer willing to remain quiet in the face of exclusion from their own urban spaces. And behind each public march lay a deeper, more private question. What does this ongoing crisis mean for the future of families, the prospects of a younger generation, and the fabric of community life in Portugal? The human cost, generations at a crossroads. Housing instability in Portugal is not just about unaffordable rents or vacant apartments. It is reshaping how entire generations live their lives. The human cost reveals itself most clearly among young adults, caught at a crossroads where independence, family, and stability have been pushed further out of reach. For those in their late 20s and early 30s, the central milestone of leaving home has shifted from a rite of passage to an unattainable goal. In 2022, more than half of Portuguese aged 25-34 still lived with their parents. This is not a reflection of cultural preference but of necessity. Even those with steady jobs find that a median salary covers little more than basic living costs and falls well short of today's rents in Lisbon or Porto. A small studio near the city center can absorb nearly all monthly earnings, leaving no room for food, transport, or savings. Independence now often requires either inherited wealth or family support, turning what once was a universal step into a privilege. This delay in independence carries broader consequences. Portugal already reports one of the lowest fertility rates in Europe, around 1.3 children per woman, well below the level needed to maintain a stable population. The connection to housing is direct. Couples earning average incomes hesitate to start families when they cannot secure homes of their own. Without stable housing, family planning feels precarious. The result is visible in national statistics. Since 2010, Portugal's population has quietly declined, with each year of weak birth rates sharpening the imbalance between young and old. The daily compromises caused by housing strain are visible everywhere. In Lisbon, students accepted to universities often face long commutes because living nearby is unaffordable. A young nursing student may travel several hours by train and bus each day simply to attend classes and practice shifts. Nurses, teachers, and hospitality staff in both Lisbon and Porto regularly endure the same burdens to reach workplaces they cannot afford to live near. These commutes impose more than inconvenience. Time for study, rest, or family vanishes into hours spent on buses and trains. For many, the exhaustion itself becomes a marker of lost opportunity. Even relocation inland, intended as an escape, rarely provides a full solution. Families that move from Lisbon to Santarém or Setúbal, or from Porto to neighboring towns, often discover that rising demand has already driven prices higher there too. As city residents leave en masse for smaller places, locals who once counted on affordability in these towns are squeezed themselves. Villages and mid-sized cities, once safe havens for working families, begin replicating the pressures of Lisbon and Porto. The wave rolls outward, catching more regions in its path. For some, the only option left is leaving Portugal altogether. Emigration, long a feature of Portuguese history, has returned under new conditions. This time the push factor is not unemployment but the impossibility of affording housing in their own cities. Skilled workers, engineers, nurses, IT specialists are choosing to relocate to Northern Europe, the UK, or other destinations that combine higher wages with more attainable housing markets. Each departure drains Portugal of both talent and potential taxpayers, deepening what analysts describe as a modern brain drain. The cost is not only personal to those who leave but national. Younger workers educated in Portuguese institutions are exporting their skills without returning the long-term contributions needed to sustain pensions and health care. The demographic pressures this creates are immense. A country with shrinking youth populations and an expanding elderly base faces fiscal strain that cannot be solved by housing policy alone. Systems of care, schools when young populations shrink, hospitals when elderly populations expand, become increasingly unbalanced. Pension schemes designed for broader workforces strain under the weight of demographic contraction. Each of these trends interlocks, and each is closely tied to the inability of younger residents to secure housing and build stable lives within Portugal's borders. The lived reality behind the numbers adds another dimension. Families forced from central neighborhoods often describe a sense of cultural loss as well as economic displacement. Parents who raised their children in Lisbon's residential quarters now worry that their grandchildren will never experience living there. Students left demoralized by long commutes feel discouraged about their futures. Older residents lament watching whole communities unravel as neighbors depart and schools close. For them, what disappears is not only affordability, but a way of life that once provided continuity across generations. Emotions run high in these circumstances. Many Portuguese who endured the austerity years of the Eurozone crisis feel betrayed that once recovery arrived, its fruits bypassed them. Housing has become the most visible symbol of exclusion, proof that prosperity is being shared unevenly. This sense of betrayal mixes despair with anger. Despair that hard work no longer grants access to independence, anger that government policies open doors to investors and tourists but not to citizens needing shelter. The effect is a slow erosion of identity. Entire communities shaped by multi-generational continuity are dissolving, leaving many residents adrift in their own country. Particularly harsh is the way housing insecurity translates into postponed family life. Couples speak of delaying marriage or deciding against children altogether because they cannot secure a home. With fertility rates already among the lowest in Europe, each decision deepens demographic fragility. Young adults who remain in shared apartments or parental homes confront not just postponed independence, but postponed adulthood, left unable to plan stable futures. For them, migration abroad often becomes the only path to claiming what feels like a normal life. The combined result of these pressures is a country at risk of losing both its youth and its stability. Schools in rural towns close when enrollment drops too low to sustain classrooms. Hospitals scale back services when populations thin to the point of unsustainability. Whole villages, once functioning as social cores, are reduced to seasonal destinations for tourists or second home owners. And once that decline sets in, it is extraordinarily difficult to reverse. Without schools or hospitals, new families are unlikely to return. Portugal's interior shrinks while its coastal regions become increasingly unaffordable, creating a landscape of displacement across both urban and rural zones. These changes cut deeply at the social fabric. What does it mean when generations raised with hopes of European opportunity instead find themselves priced out of adulthood in their own country? What does it mean when grandparents speak to their grandchildren mainly through video calls, not because of distance across continents, but because of housing costs preventing them from staying? The emotional strain is difficult to quantify but sits at the heart of the crisis. It is a sense that the possibility of continuity is slipping away, replaced by transience and fragmentation. When seen together, the human impacts reshape how the housing crisis is understood. The issue is not simply financial. It is about missed independence, disrupted family formation, forced migration, emptying villages, and futures lost. Housing is the thread connecting all of it. Stability in where people live determines whether they can build lives, raise children, and remain tied to communities. Without it, every other aspect of society begins to falter. Analysts increasingly describe Portugal's moment as a generational crossroads. Young adults delay independence, fertility declines, professionals leave for stability abroad, and older communities diminish. Behind each trend is a single origin point, the ongoing breakdown in affordable housing. This makes the stakes more than economic. They are existential, touching on whether Portugal can sustain itself as a nation oriented toward families and long-term continuity. And yet, Portugal is not isolated. Similar symptoms are visible across southern Europe, countries where wages trail northern standards but foreign demand for housing grows relentlessly. The pressures shaping Portugal's crossroads resemble those reshaping other societies, where cities transform into contested spaces between locals and global capital. The human cost felt in Lisbon or Porto today is mirrored in cities across the continent, signaling a broader pattern that now extends far beyond Portugal's borders. Europe's shared dilemma. Across southern Europe, similar signs of strain can be seen. What Portugal is experiencing does not stand alone. It reflects a regional pattern where housing has grown detached from domestic wages and increasingly tied to flows of foreign capital, tourism, and mobile professionals. Analysts emphasize that the pressures reshaping Lisbon or Porto echo dynamics also reported in Spain, Greece, and Italy. What was once characterized as an isolated paradox is actually part of a shared dilemma playing out across the Mediterranean. The similarities are impossible to ignore, even if the local details vary. The scale of Portugal's price escalation makes the issue especially visible. Eurostat reported that in the first quarter of 2025, Portugal recorded the fastest house price growth anywhere in the European Union, an annual increase of nearly 16%. That extraordinary pace anchors Portugal in the European debate, not because it is entirely unique, but because it demonstrates the trajectory facing several countries on the continent's southern edge if the same dynamics remain unchecked. Across the region, residents earn stagnant wages while contending with housing markets inflated by global demand pressures. Spain provides one of the closest comparisons. Major cities there have long attracted significant tourist traffic, and more recently they have drawn remote workers arriving on newly created digital visas. Governments have tried restrictions on short-term rentals, particularly in urban centers where residents organized against touristification. Yet reports consistently show that enforcement struggles to keep up with market demand. The result for locals is a steady upward push in rents and property values, linked as much to external consumption as to local conditions. In that way, Spain's experience mirrors the same cycle Portugal faces now. Rents rising faster than incomes, families displaced from central districts, and community identity strained. Greece presents another striking parallel. In Athens, residency by investment schemes resembling Portugal's Golden Visa attracted a wave of foreign purchases. Apartments in historic neighborhoods shifted from resident use into investment assets, while locals confronted rising prices despite sluggish wage growth. Island regions dependent on seasonal tourism replicate patterns familiar from Portugal's Algarve. Housing stock increasingly serving temporary visitors rather than permanent workers. The public mobilization that followed shows the frustration is not cultural or incidental. It comes from a shared economic structure where homes double as both shelter and investment vehicles for outsiders. Italy displays similar features in its tourist-exposed regions. Cities such as Florence and Venice have documented population declines in historic centers, as properties repurpose into short-term accommodation and second homes. Residents face not just affordability problems, but the hollowing out of once stable neighborhoods. Rome's central districts also reflect rising external ownership, reinforcing divides between asset holders and longtime tenants. Although northern Italy, with its industrial economy, displays somewhat different pressures, the broader trend remains recognizable. Where foreign demand and tourist spending dominate, the resident population finds itself struggling to secure long-term space. These southern European experiences strengthen the perception of a Mediterranean housing model under strain. While northern cities such as Berlin or Amsterdam operate under higher wages and tighter regulation that offset some upward pressures, their southern counterparts balance low wage structures against high outside demand. Residents earn salaries closer to €1,000 a month, while competing with remote workers or investors judging prices against far wealthier benchmarks. As in Portugal, the imbalance widens yearly, leaving locals displaced or resigned to long commutes, while governments scramble to draft interventions. Another feature now common across the region is the rise of digital nomad visas. Once promoted as innovative policies linking cities to a global workforce, they now appear across Spain, Greece, Croatia, Italy, and Portugal. Each visa requires proof of income far above domestic benchmarks, typically multiple times the minimum wage. The consequence is predictable. Those granted access bring purchasing power several times greater than the locals with whom they share rental markets. Where residents see unaffordable rents, remote professionals see bargains compared with their home cities. The contrast underlines how public policies designed to attract global talent also accelerate displacement in places already fragile. The broader outcome is a division across Europe itself. On one side are households, landlords, and investors who benefit from rising property values, seeing their assets climb in value while tax revenues increase for governments. On the other side are citizens whose wages anchor them locally, trying to compete in markets no longer oriented to them. The imbalance is especially sharp between northern and southern capitals. Whereas Germany or the Netherlands can offset demand with higher incomes and stricter housing rules, Portugal, Spain, Greece, and Italy face costs racing ahead of domestic earnings. What emerges is a sense of exclusion at home, where locals feel pushed out not only by newcomers but by the policies that invited them. The social consequences flow naturally from this divide. In Portugal, as in Southern Europe more broadly, schools in central neighborhoods close as family residents depart, grocery shops give way to short-term services catering to visitors, and fertility rates decline because long-term planning feels impossible. Young adults delay independence, couples postpone children, and older residents watch established communities fragment. Housing insecurity becomes more than a financial burden. It begins to reshape demographic futures across a whole region. Portugal, then, is both a case study and a warning. Its combination of low wages, high tourist inflows, and openness to foreign investment magnifies trends visible elsewhere but not yet as pronounced. Observers across Europe treat Portugal as a kind of laboratory. Will its reforms manage to restrain speculative forces, or will the imbalance deepen further? Success in Lisbon or Porto might provide examples that other countries could adopt. Failure would reinforce the sense that Southern Europe's housing systems are structurally vulnerable, unable to protect residents against shifts in global demand. From a wider perspective, the crisis is changing how inequality itself is understood. Access to reasonably priced housing now rivals wages as the critical divider of stability. A stable tenancy allows families to plan their futures, while those excluded face constant displacement and uncertainty. Differences manifest geographically too. Individuals born into already internationalized markets encounter far steeper barriers to establishing independent lives than those in less affected regions. This distribution of opportunity is fast becoming a defining line of division in Europe's social fabric. Experiments with solutions vary and the contrasts are stark. Northern cities such as Berlin have tested stronger rent controls, including temporary freezes that sought to halt escalation, even when those measures faced legal challenges. These efforts reflect a willingness to intervene against market forces more directly. Southern governments have typically introduced softer measures, limited caps on annual increases, or restrictions on issuing new short-term rental licenses. While politically visible, these policies have not always shifted underlying trends. The contrast highlights a deeper challenge: whether states are willing to confront structural drivers at the risk of discouraging investment. At its heart, the dilemma is one of direction. Governments must choose whether to prioritize residents through more forceful intervention or continue balancing outward openness with patchwork protections. Both paths carry costs. Too little action risks broader despair and dislocation. Too much risks deterring international capital that many economies rely on. This tension defines the uncertainty across Southern Europe's housing markets today. Portugal's position within this landscape shows both the pressures already common elsewhere and the stakes of choosing a path forward. Its rapid price growth, confirmed by the 16% surge in early 2025, demonstrates how quickly conditions can escalate when local incomes decouple from property values. For citizens across the continent, the takeaway is simple. This is not an isolated housing bubble. It is part of a Europe-wide shift where property increasingly reflects global capital flows and tourism demand rather than wages earned by local residents. The questions that remain are no longer about whether the crisis exists, but about what comes next. The choices Portugal makes will reverberate outward, shaping not only its own housing future, but also the debate across Europe as a whole. The next issue is whether those choices can repair conditions before the cycle deepens further. What the future holds. Looking ahead, the question is no longer whether Portugal has a housing crisis, but what shape the future might take. Analysts agree the next phase will not bring a sharp collapse in prices, but rather slower adjustments. Some forecast a period of flattening, where growth cools from the double-digit surges recorded in recent years. Optimists see this as an opening, a breathing space that could help wages start catching up, however gradually. Pessimists argue that prices have already been pulled so far above local income levels that even slowed growth locks housing into a permanently higher baseline. Between these two outlooks lies one unavoidable point of consensus. Without meaningful change, the damage to Portuguese society will deepen. One area of debate focuses on who should be allowed to buy homes in the first place. Some commentators raise the idea of restricting foreign purchases in densely populated areas or taxing second home buyers more heavily. These ideas draw inspiration from experiments in other countries, such as Canada's foreign buyer taxes, where policymakers have tried to cool speculative demand. Supporters argue Portugal needs similar defenses to protect the urban housing stock from being treated as global investment inventory. Critics caution that shutting off this flow of money could frustrate developers, cut tax revenue, and slow an economy still reliant on tourism and foreign capital. While no sweeping ban appears imminent, the debate signals a growing willingness to consider sharper controls in areas under the most pressure. At the same time, Portugal's most tangible policy effort is unfolding through Construir Portugal, the government's core housing strategy. Launched with a pledge to deliver about 59,000 new homes by 2030, backed by €4.2 billion, it represents the single largest commitment in decades to increase supply. Officials frame the program as a chance to deliberately expand affordable options rather than leaving outcomes to market speculation. By using state-owned land, streamlining planning approvals, and leveraging European funding mechanisms, the government aims to pull thousands of units into circulation for ordinary residents. Yet the challenges are steep. Delivering this promise means overcoming lengthy permitting processes and ensuring that output remains accessible to middle and low-income households rather than drifting back into speculative cycles. Other initiatives are expected to accompany this push. Credit lines have been announced to support build-to-rent projects, a way of encouraging developers to add long-term rental supply rather than building exclusively for sale. These schemes aim to reduce financing risks for developers while preserving affordability in new units. Housing cooperatives are also gaining momentum as grassroots experiments. By pooling community resources to buy or construct housing collectively, residents attempt to remove speculation from the process and guarantee stable rents. Early pilots in Lisbon and Porto show that, while modest in size, these models can keep apartments within reach of workers who would otherwise be pushed aside by the market. Together, credit guarantees and cooperatives illustrate a shift. Housing policy is beginning to look not just at raw construction numbers, but at structures designed to hold affordability in place for the long term. The risks of failing to deliver, however, remain significant. Economists warn that unless affordability improves, Portugal faces an extended demographic crisis. Trained professionals are already leaving because they cannot translate their salaries into stable housing at home. Nurses and teachers, vital to basic services, struggle to rent near their workplaces. Engineers and IT specialists see far better options abroad that provide both higher wages and greater security. This outflow compounds existing population decline, threatening not only economic competitiveness, but the sustainability of public services over time. Seen in this light, the housing issue is not only a household burden, but a question of how Portugal retains the core workforce required to sustain its future. The divide between those who expect recovery and those who declare it permanently out of reach continues to shape discussion. Pessimists argue that global investment interest, international tourism, and digital nomad inflows are too entrenched to reverse. From their perspective, Portugal's affordable era is gone permanently, replaced by a housing market tethered to external wealth. Optimists remain insistent that decisive reform can shift the balance, citing examples from European cities that have stabilized markets through rent regulations, expanded public housing, and targeted protections. For them, the obstacle is less economic inevitability than political will. If the state enforces limits on speculation and expands non-market housing aggressively, they argue residents could still reclaim part of the ground lost over the last decade. Some of the most striking examples of future possibilities now appear at the community level. Grassroots groups in Lisbon have converted unused government buildings into cooperative housing blocks for young families, securing multi-year tenancies at below-market prices. In Porto, neighborhood groups successfully pressured local officials to cap short-term rental licenses, returning dozens of apartments to the long-term pool. These cases remain small, but they demonstrate that collective pressure can redirect housing from speculative to residential use. Importantly, they show the country that mobilization yields tangible outcomes. and that solutions do not always wait for national legislation to trickle down. Municipal governments have also joined forces, exploring partnerships that reduce land costs for housing, coordinate planning strategies, and seek greater access to EU-level funds. Mayors in Lisbon, Porto, Braga, and Faro have begun discussing how to apply European social housing models more systematically, combining local control with centralized funding power. While these efforts remain in the planning stages, they illustrate a growing recognition that only coordinated actions at multiple levels, national, local, and community, stand any chance of reversing current trends. Timing adds urgency. Demographic decline is already visible, and housing pressures accelerate these losses by discouraging young adults from building lives locally. Analysts consistently highlight the years leading up to 2030 as decisive. The next phase will determine whether sizable construction projects, tighter restrictions, and cooperative alternatives shift the affordability curve, or whether high prices consolidate into a permanent new baseline. Once communities are hollowed out and residents permanently emigrated, replacing them is far harder than retaining them in the first place. This makes the pace of implementation, not just policy design, the central test ahead. Portugal therefore faces multiple futures depending on how it acts in the near term. One path delivers large volumes of public or cooperative housing, restrictions that temper speculation, and tax incentives calibrated to serve residents rather than investors. Another path accepts continued globalization of housing markets, leaving local wages increasingly mismatched with property values and forcing families into displacement or emigration. Between them is a middle ground where incremental reforms slow deterioration but fail to restore balance, leaving younger generations still unable to move forward. Each scenario carries social costs, but the difference in scale depends on choices already visible in today's debates. Experts converge on one time frame. The next 5 years will decide whether reform resets the market towards stability or whether Portugal locks in a high-price baseline for the long term. That choice is not technical alone. It cuts to the deeper question of what kind of country Portugal intends to remain and who it intends to prioritize. Portugal's housing crisis is no longer only about rent or prices. It is about whether people can realistically stay in the communities that give the country continuity. Golden visa reforms in 2023 removed the real estate route for new applicants, while the government has launched Construir Portugal, a €4.2 billion plan to add about 59,000 homes by 2030. These are significant steps, but whether they are enough to turn the tide remains uncertain. The essential question is whether housing will serve residents first or continue to operate as an investment market. Tell us in the comments, would you move to Portugal now or would you wait for reforms?